At least 18 people have died so far this year in Rikers Island prison. According to the New York Times, that makes this the deadliest year since 2013, when the prison had nearly double the amount of incarcerated people. Rikers Island is New York City's main prison complex. It sits in the East River between Queens and the Bronx. The island was originally under 100 acres, but has grown to be more than 400 acres. Community activists and advocates are now calling out Governor Kathy Hochul to shut it down.
It was clear to you and the world that those CEOs watched my sister die. The government killed my sister. Rikers killed my sister. The blood of my sister is in the DA's clerk hand, the whole DOC department, the whole BOC department, because they sit on cameras and act like they're going to help us and they do nothing. We pour ourselves out into cups with holes. Nothing is being observed, I'm starting to feel. But that's not going to stop me. I am going to continue my fight.
Governor Hochul is facing opposition in the state's gubernatorial election next week by someone who supports keeping the prison open. Lee Zeldin has been endorsed by the New York City corrections officers and is calling for the repeal of the HALT Act. Joining me now to discuss this is attorney Olayemi Olurin with the Legal Aid Society of New York City. Olayemi, thank you so much for joining me on the Griot.
Hi, thank you.
What is happening here?
So Rikers was declared a human rights crisis last year when we had 16 deaths. That was considered the deadliest year since 2013. And then here comes this year, and we're already at 18 deaths. So originally, we had the campaign to close Rikers, and Rikers was on track to close by 2026. Then they said that the plan was delayed and pushed back till 2027. So originally, Mayor Eric Adams said, as he was running, he said he would support the plan to close Rikers because Rikers is in desperate need of systemic change.
Let me pause you there because there are people who want to say, why are we closing Rikers, right? We got prisoners, we got jails, we got violence, we got crime, we got all the ingredients, and it seems to me that you need Rikers. What's the argument for closing it?
Rikers is a pretrial detention center. So I think Rikers is one of the places that's reputation precedes it to its own detriment. Because people have heard of it so much, it's so infamous. They think it's this infamous place for terrible, horrible prisoners. But in actuality, the people that are convicted, that are incarcerated at Rikers have not been convicted of a crime. They haven't had their trial. They're simply there because they don't have the money to afford bail. So right now, despite the fact that New York City is a city with 10 million people in it, with 42% of the people are white, Rikers has a over 90% Black and brown population makeup. And even though the facility was only built to hold 3,000 people, it currently holds 5,000 people, is why if you've seen the 5,000 people and they are stacked on top of each other. I don't know if you've seen the photos, but it's horrific. People are literally being kept in shower stalls. They're on top of one another. People dying because they've been left in intake, in pens, in their wheelchairs. So the situation is completely out of control. So that's why I closed Rikers. I mean, Rikers is a pretrial detention center. People can go home and fight their charges from the outside. And that's why we originally got bail reform so that we could begin to decarcerate Rikers. So prior to bail reform and prior to 2020, the rate for failures to return to court were about 15%, and now it's at 9%.
Okay, so hold on. I want to pause you there again. I want to break this down for my audience. Because my audience is going to say, again, well, we need bail. Right. And in fact, I've even had to have this conversation with activists when police officers get bail. They're like, make it $1 million, make it $10 million. I'm like, that's not the point of bail. Bail should not be a punishment. I want you to explain this, what you just said again, because people assume that without bail, nobody would show up to court.
Right. And that's just simply not the truth. The vast majority of people return to court. That just always was the case. Like I said, the failure to return to court rate was only 15% even before bail reform, and it's only 9% now. And as much as we sensationalize around violent crime and felonies and all these kinds of things, first of all, the majority of things in our criminal system, over 80% nationwide of our criminal cases are misdemeanors, traffic offenses, and nonviolent crimes. But in New York City, most things are misdemeanors, period. But of what's charged as felonies, over 80% ends up result as a non-criminal conviction altogether. Then when we look at actual felonies and rearrest, so the Brennan Center did a study and they looked at over 100,000 cases from 2020 to now and found that in less than 2% of cases, people were rearrested for felonies or any violent crime. So there's that. But importantly, and this is a condition that is always true about bail, and I need people to understand this, is if you violate the terms of release, if you are out on bail, whether or not it be that the judge let you out or you paid bail, If you commit another crime, if you violate the terms of your release, you will be rearrested. And additionally, New York City retained the cash bail system. So even with bail reform that made it non-eligible for certain misdemeanors, some non-violent felonies and non-violent crimes for bail to not be set on them, bail can and will still be set on violent crime in New York City.
Okay, so then all the stages to be set to close Rikers Island, except Rikers isn't closed. And we got to take a break in a second. But in the midst of all of this non-closing action, there are people dying. What allows this to happen? We don't need more COs. There's plenty of COs there. There's no lack of knowledge. It's not like the wardens and the correctional staff doesn't know that people are sick and dying and sitting in stalls, etc. All the things you laid out so clearly. So in the minute we have left, why is this happening? How are people still dying?
Neglect and depraved indifference. This is just an executive decision. As much as we'd like to put it on an understaffed, this is just mismanagement. We have over 7,000 corrections officers at Rikers, far more, thousands more than we have incarcerated people. And it's not a lack of resources. Rikers gets over $860 million every year. What it is mismanagement and the inability for certain union contracts and structural constraints that exist for the state level to be able to do anything. So that's why advocates have been pushing for receivership, which Rikers has a hearing next month for a federal judge, Judge Swain, who has been Rikers has been under federal monitor for human rights abuses for the last 6 years. And a federal judge, Judge T. Swain, has repeatedly ordered judicial mandates to get Rikers in compliance, and repeatedly they've demonstrably failed. So now we are pushing for a receivership that would allow then for an independent and nonpartisan expert to be appointed by the court, and they would be given wide latitude to get Rikers up to constitutional compliance. And once that actually was happening, a time set by the judge, and we actually got it up to constitutional compliance, it would automatically revert back to the state local agencies.
So receivership seems like it's the way to go for a lot of people. I want to unpack that just a little bit more. We're going to finish this conversation on the other side of the break, because Rikers Island is not just a key location in the criminal justice system or criminal legal system. It's a representation of mass incarceration for the entire country. Everybody stay right here. We'll be back with a little bit more with the grill. We have been talking with attorney and activist and all-around genius, Olayemi Olurin. She's with the Legal Aid Society of New York City. We've been talking about the human rights crisis in Rikers Island. Before you go, I want to talk about solutions. You started to talk about receivership. Say a little bit more about that, but also talk to me about the big picture here, because we don't just want to close Rikers Island if we're saying that it's representative of a bigger problem. We want to close all these kind of places. So what do we do?
Absolutely. Listen, it's ridiculous that right now in America, not only do we have 2 million people incarcerated, but over 400,000 people are being held pretrial. That is insane. So what we see happening in Rikers, we see happening in Philadelphia, we see happening in Harris County, we see happening in Chicago, and that is a problem. So we obviously need to be working towards that. But in the interim, even though we have the plan to close Rikers and we're working on it and we're seeing constant pushback and unfortunately efforts to make more jails in its place, we need to do something about the deaths. People are dying, real people are dying, and we need to figure out how to slow that. So a receivership gives us that option. Right? It allows us to recognize what we've already known, what our own current mayor recognized when he said Rikers was out of control and we need systemic change, is that this is not getting better. Every year, the deaths are just continuing to mount. So receivership allows them, in the process of figuring out how to decarcerate Rikers and moving towards the plan to close Rikers, it allows us to get a nonpartisan expert that doesn't have all these constraints, the union contracts, the state regulations, all of these different barriers.
They're not compromised.
Exactly. And so we get that person and they can institute the change. And even though receivership is, I'm sure it sounds new to everybody, it's not new. We've had it for a long time, and we even used it back in Brown versus Board when the schools wouldn't comply. They reshaped receivership to force the schools to get in compliance. So it's been used before in our history, and it's been used for about 9 other prisons and jails that needed to be brought up to compliance in our nation's history. So a receivership right now is what advocates really want to see happen.
Well, a receivership seems like an interesting way to go. We're going to have you back to unpack that further. In the meantime, we are demanding that the world pay attention to this crisis. These are largely Black and brown people dying in these jails. These are poor people dying in these jails. These are unconvicted people dying in these jails. And for that reason, we have to continue to do the work of applying pressure and demanding justice. Olayemi, thank you so much for your fierce advocacy and for joining us today for this conversation.